This is a discussion on St. Augustine and his views on God and the human condition. In this lecture, we want to see how St. Augustine addresses two very important questions. The first is, what does it mean to be made or created in the image of God? What does that mean? We hear that phrase, but what exactly does that mean? Does it mean that God is a relatively short, pudgy, balding fellow and I look like God? Probably not. So what exactly does that mean, to be made in the image of God? And the second question is, what is original sin? Again, there's a theological idea of original sin, and we've probably all heard the term, but what exactly does it mean? And what's going to be interesting to us is that both of these questions will receive the same answer. One answer will answer both questions. Both questions have the same answer. So that's what we want to take a look at. And to be able to see how Augustine thinks about this, we want to take a look at a very famous passage from his book, The Confessions. You can find it in Book 2 of the Confessions, where known as the Pear stealing incident. So let's set a little scene here. In this chapter of his book, he talks about when he's 16 years old, and he's his parents thought education was very important, but evidently there was some sort of a setback or whatever, and Augustine was unable to attend school, so he's home, spinning his wheels in a way. And he's a young fellow, and he's becoming a man, and that's something that his father recognized while Augustine was home. The father and son went down to the gymnasium to wrestle, and they saw each other and without their clothes on, and they're showering off or whatever. And Augustine's father takes a look at his son's physique and says, he's becoming a man. In fact, he goes home and he tells Augustine's mother, Monica, Saint Monica, about, look at our little son here is becoming a man, and maybe get him a wife, he could start a family. And his mother gave Augustine some good advice, finish your schooling, get your education, get established, get a job, and then maybe would be a good time to start a family. Augustine writes in this book, The Confessions, that his parents loved him, and he knew that they did, but he felt like maybe they didn't fully understand him. And what teenager doesn't have that feeling, at least from time to time. It's a fascinating book. It's in many ways our first example of a kind of an autobiography, but it's not an autobiography in the sense that somebody might write a tell-all account of their escapades in life like we might read today. Augustine is looking at his life. These are not his journals from when he was 16. He's looking back on his life when he's an older man, and he's reflecting on things that he discovered about himself. And he thought, this is not just interesting because of what it says about me. It's not just idiosyncratic. He thinks that the things that he sees in himself would apply to all of us. And I think one of the things we need to do is listen to his story, listen to his insights, and reflect on whether his insights would apply to us as well. Maybe they will, or maybe they won't. He tells some very interesting stories too. He says, like, when I was an infant, he says, I don't remember being an infant. Do you? What is your earliest memory? How old are you when you have your first memory? Is it 2? Is it 3 or 4? It's very interesting that we were there the entire time of our infancy, and we had brains, but we have no recollection. So he says, the nursemaid told me about myself when I was an infant. She told me I was always at the breast. I was always hungry. And he says that's interesting, because why would I be always hungry? Why wouldn't I eat until I was full or satisfied and then stop? But she told me I wouldn't stop. I would eat plenty of food, enough to nourish me for sure, and I would still want to eat. Why is that? He says, that's interesting. That's what does that tell me about myself? And he talks about later on when he's in school. He says, like everybody else, I had some favorite subjects and subjects I didn't really care for. He says, for instance, one of my favorite subjects was you and I would call literature, the stories. I love the stories, the adventures, the escapades that the people engaged in their adventures. I loved all that stuff and all the fantasy and the heroics and the drama. I love stories. I couldn't get enough of stories. You know what class I didn't like? Grammar. He says that's kind of interesting because grammar is the skeleton, the anatomy, the structure upon which you could build any story. So if I learned grammar, I would have the ability to tell all stories. But I didn't like them. I didn't like grammar. I didn't like all the grammatical rules, all those rules. But you can say it this way, you can't say it that way. And if you were a speaker of Philly English like me, you could say, well, I ain't gonna do that. And the grammar book said, well, you shouldn't say ain't. But you understood what I said, and it didn't get in the way of the story. And hey, that's how people talk anyway. I didn't really care for grammar. Loved the stories, didn't like grammar. And he says, okay, here are 2 insights about me. But actually, I don't think they're idiosyncratic. I don't think it's just about me. I think it tells me something about what it means to be human. What do those 2 stories have in common? One, I'm an infant and I eat more than I need. Second, I'm a student in school, and I have a favorite class, all the stories and adventures and the fantasy. But I have a least favorite class is grammar with all the rules. What is it? He says, well, I want to keep that in mind. So in this book too, Augustine tells about this incident where he steals pears. Now, you might think, ooh, stealing pears, wow, but you got to remember, there weren't liquor stores to knock over, there weren't cars to jack or anything like that. Pears had value. They were grown and they did have value. He says, well, I stole pears. And he said, I only stole with my friends, and we were laughing the entire time. I remember that. He says we would go, more or less, he would say, I'm paraphrasing, we would go down the street after dinner at night, and we'd hop the neighbor's fence, and we'd go in there, and we'd steal his pears, and we'd be laughing our heads off the entire time. He said, why did I steal his pears? He said, I didn't need them. I just had dinner. I wasn't hungry. We weren't going to sell them out of the back of the car because we didn't have cars. We weren't stealing them for their monetary value. We weren't going to deal in black market pears or anything like that. Actually, they weren't the best pears. In fact, we had our own pear tree that was pretty good. Really, what we did was we got in there, we grabbed the pears, we would take a couple of bites and we just throw them away. We'd throw them to the pigs. Waste them. Why do we do that? And he thinks this anecdote has something, again, in common with the story about his favorite and least favorite classes and the story about him as an infant. Why does he steal? Well, he steals, he says, because he likes the crime. He likes the sin. Well, why does he like the sin? He says, that doesn't seem like something we should like. He said, in fact, sometimes my buddies and I, we would get together and we would try to outdo each other in telling each other how bad we were, what kind of bad things we did. And one person would say, well, I did this, and somebody else would say, oh yeah, well, I did this and that, and the third person would say, well, I did this and that and the other thing, trying to outdo each other in all the bad stuff we done. He says that's puzzling. Why didn't we try to outdo each other in all the good things we could do? Why not? That's kind of interesting to me too. What does that tell me about myself? And he says that, well, really, what's going on there, he says, is a kind of sense of freedom, but it's a truncated liberty. Truncated means cut off. It's not all the way there. He says, because if you think about the stories that I was telling there, I ate, I wanted, I desired more than I needed. I had an inordinate desire. And when I didn't like grammar, what I didn't like about grammar was the rules. And when I stole the pears, what I didn't like was the sign in the yard that said, keep out. What I didn't like was the fence. I didn't like somebody telling me what I could and couldn't do. I wanted to be free of all those barriers, of all those limits. Right? I wanted to feel free. I wanted to feel completely free. In fact, Augustine says, you know what? It was kind of a desire to be God. Felt like I wanted to be what God was, the one that set the rules, not the one that had to obey the rules. I wanted to be the one who could set the rules or ignore the rules and be free of the rules. He said, it's interesting too that I only would do this with my friends. Why? If I enjoyed the, breaking the rules, well, I didn't need them, did I? I could just go down there and break the rule. Don't come in the yard. Well, I came in the yard. This is mine. Well, let's see about that. I could break the rules all by myself, but why didn't I? Why wouldn't I break the rules just by myself? Because, he says, I needed a kind of recognition. I needed the others to see me be free. And why did we try to outdo each other with our stories about how bad we were? It's, well, kind of think about it. I suppose now this would not be the kind of crowd that you would hang with. I'm sure, but you could almost like picture in the movies, bad guys movies. The bad guys are hanging around. The first one says something like, "You know what I did last night? I knocked over a liquor store." And the second guy says, "You know what I did last night? I knocked over a liquor store and then I stole a car and drove away." The third guy says, "You know what I did last night? I knocked over a liquor store. I stole a car to drive away, but before I drove away, I shot the proprietor just to watch him die." And at that point, I think what happens is the other two bad guys do what I like to call the step back. The kind of move away from the one who's willing to just have no limits to what they're willing to do. They'll do anything. They're just like over the top bad. And Augustine was saying, in a sense, that I was looking for that step back with my friends. I wanted them to be both in awe of me, that I could have no limits. There's nothing that could hold me back. And I wanted them to have a little bit of fear. I wanted them to see me with saying, he's the kind of person that I got to be careful with. If he's willing to do that to somebody else, he might be willing to do that to me. In a way, he's trying to convey, not that he was talking about, killing, murdering, that kind of thing, but he says that the structure of what was going on was like that. I was trying to be free, totally free, and I was trying to have others recognize me as free, as being without bounds, as being without limits, with a kind of fear and awe. And who does the Bible, how does the Bible say we ought to approach God? Exactly like that, in fear and in awe. So there's this kind of perverse desire for community and recognition, but it's a weird kind of community, because it's community that kind of breaks itself apart. I need you with me so that you move away from me. I need you with me so that you back off from me somehow. That you find me dangerous to be with, and yet something attractive about that element of me that has no fear of dangers and has no respect for boundaries or rules or limits. Okay, well, fine. If that's what he's doing, if that's what his desire is all about, a desire to be without any limitations whatsoever, well, why? Why would he desire to be God? Why not? Why not desire to be what he is, a creature of God, of a certain nature and not others, with certain limits? Of course, why not accept that? Why desire to be God? Answer: he's made in the image of God. Made in the image of God. And now you could start to see the answer, the one answer to the two questions. Right? What does it mean to be made in the image of God? It means, well, we have to see exactly what it means, but we could put a term on it, a term that's not in Augustine's Confession, but we could say it's self-transcendence. The idea is that there's something about us that moves beyond whatever our boundaries are. And that's God. God is, without those boundaries. We want to be without those boundaries. But breaking boundaries is just what sin is. It is what doing bad is all about. It's breaking the law promulgated by the creator of human beings. So, let's try to think this through. Human beings in the image and likeness of God. What does that mean? Well, start with God. What's God like? If we want to know what we're like and we're made in the image of God, we should say something about what God is like. And if you thought about it for a second, you'd say, well, God is all powerful, omnipotent. You would say that God is all knowing, omniscient. You would say that God is, everywhere and every when, omnipresent. God is omni-everything. And if you wanted to roll that all up in a ball and summarize, you'd say, well, God is infinite. Now, you have to be careful about this definition, so let me insist on it for a second. When I say infinite here, don't think of infinity as you might find it in mathematics. The definition you want to have in mind is that which is limited by nothing other than itself. Limited by nothing other than itself. Why? Because if you didn't understand infinity like that when it comes to God, then you would have what the philosopher Hegel called a bad infinite. And a bad infinite a metaphor for that might be like milk. Suppose you had an infinite quantity of milk and you spilled it. And it filled up your room and then your house and then your neighborhood and then your city and your nation and the oceans and the earth and then the space between the earth and the moon and it just went on and on. What you'd have is a mess, right? You just have a mess flowing over everything. But being able to make decisions and decide things and choose things means to put limits on things. If God chooses to do one thing, then God is not choosing at that time to do something else. If God chooses to make humans, okay, that's a limitation. He could have made other things, but in a particular case, he made humans, and he made humans the way he made humans, and not some other kind of way. So there are limits, but no outside limits. Nothing said to God, listen, make humans and make them this way. God has no external limits. But because God is personal, because God is a person, God makes choices, and in that sense, there are some limitations. If God does one thing, then he can't at the same time do the opposite of those things. So think about it that way. God is infinite. Okay, well, what are humans like? What are we like? Well, we could do some things, but we can't do everything. We can know some things. How about you? But we can't know everything. And, we're here. And we're now. We're not there. And then we're here and now. We're located in space and time. And, of course, we're bounded by our birth and our death. So you could say that humans are finite. Finite. Okay, God is infinite. Humans are finite. But it seems like we're not in the image of God or the likeness of God. It seems like we're the opposite of God. God is infinite and humans are finite. That's like being popular and unpopular. Those are opposites, not images of each other. Well, okay, that's true. It's true. We're not God. That's an important lesson. But there's a way in which we are the image of God. For instance, if you thought about which one of those three omnis that we talked about before, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, I know we can't attain or achieve any one of those three, but if you thought about which one of those three do we come closest to being able to overcome? Not that we get there. I grant we don't get there, but which one do we come closest to? Well, can you lift a 500-pound boulder? You say, I can't lift a 500-pound boulder. But I can lift a 500-pound boulder. I can lift a 500-pound boulder. You don't believe me? I just get my backhoe, which is parked out in the yard, and I just fire that thing up, and I go to the boulder, and I grab a hold of it with the backhoe, and I lift it up. I lifted it up. Can I fly in the air? Sure I can. I go right down to the Philly airport, buy myself a ticket, hop on a plane, go wherever. Oh. So maybe we can do anything. Can I live underwater the rest of my life? Sure, as long as I can get a ticket to a nuclear submarine, and that submarine could be stocked with supplies, I could live underwater the rest of my life. Can I become a Martian? You know what? There's people right now, I'm not making this up, you Google it. There are people right now on the waiting list to take a one-way, and it would be a one-way, trip to Mars to start to colonize. There are people who are thinking like that. And someday, probably not my lifetime, but someday, somebody's going to do that. So we're not omnipotent, but it's hard to think what we're not. Well, what about omniscient? I don't know about you, but don't you have to study for tests? I have to study for tests. But on the other hand, I just reach into my pocket and I pull out that device I have with me and I say, hey Google, tell me, right? I on my phone, I have access to every important philosophical text that's ever been written. I carry it around with me at all times, and all I have to do is just enter a search. What can't I know? It's pretty good. No, it seems like the one that we would have the hardest time overcoming is the omnipresence. I mean, I'm here. I'm not down the shore. I'm here. I'm here right now in my office talking to you. That would seem to be the one we are least likely to overcome. And yet, I'm here, but I'm having effects there, where you are. Or, for instance, I could write a book that communicates with people who are not here. Augustine wrote the Confessions, and he's not here anymore, and we're still talking about him. 1,500 or more years later, we're talking about St. Augustine. So he's with us in an important sense. His reach is much further than the here now that you might think is all that he had. I'm now, but I could be then. I can remember the past. I can imagine the future. I do it all the time. When I'm in class with students, there are a lot of times I look out. Sad to say, I look out and I see some students that I know that student's not here right now. And if I tap them, I say, "Where'd you go right now?" If they were honest, they might say, sorry, I was just remembering the great time I had down the shore this past weekend. I was back then, or I was thinking about this exam I have next week in my other class, and I got to think about it. I was already at that place. I'm already there. That's something we can do. I always retain some past and anticipate some future. The philosopher Martin Heidegger, 20th century German thinker, helped us to see, I'm never simply just present, never simply just here now. The very meaning of the class you're taking now can't be found in the now. The meaning of the class you're taking now will be determined by how things go in the future. What it really will have meant, you won't know until later. That's the way that we work. And even our consciousness works that way. If I were to slow down my sentences, that's really annoying, right? If I really slowed it down like that, you would say, "Oh, stop that! It's too bad." You're like those sloths in the Zootopia movie, if you've seen that. That's you're not remembering in the sense of memory the first part of my sentence, and you're not projecting out in the future like, well, what's exactly he's going to say, but just to hear me say words, or just to listen to a melody in music. The theorists call this retention and protension. You're always carrying along what's already passed, and you're reaching out to the future in order to make this the very near future, in order to make sense of my sentence or to enjoy the melody of a song. That's just the way we're built. We are not as here now at some point called the present like we tend to think we are. So we are not omnipotent, we're not omniscient, we're not omnipresent, but there's something about humans that's different from everything else in creation, or most other things in creation, that says, well, we have limits, but what are limits that you could keep finding ways to get beyond. You could say, well, human beings are limited by our DNA, but we now understand our DNA is code, and code can be edited and re-edited. And aren't we doing those kinds of things for better or ill? We are doing those things. So to say what a human is, even what it is to try to define something, to delimit something, to put boundaries around something. And we're the kind of something that it's very hard in the end to put boundaries around. So that is what is meant by this phrase that I'm introducing here, self-transcendence. Whatever it is that we are always able to seemingly get beyond what we are. God is infinite, limited by nothing other than God's self, but humans are finite. Yes, but self-transcendent, able to get outside of ourselves, to transcend our boundaries. And look, that is great. That is so important. That's the basis of conscious life. That's the basis of communication, of learning, of experience, of love. If we couldn't do that, and there are things that can't, like my coffee cup. My coffee cup has no experience of being a coffee cup or of communicating with anyone or anything. We're the kind of beings that can do that because we're self-transcendent. We're different from other kinds of things. There may be, and I think this is important to recognize, that some non-human animals, sentient souls, I think have certainly a limited transcendence. But the question is whether they do or do not have selves. The tradition of Western philosophy has never been totally fair to non-human animal life. And it's a great field of philosophy. It's a transdisciplinary field, philosophy and zoology and botany and environmental sciences. Very, very interesting to see how like we are to other beings. The tradition has always drawn kind of a bright line between humans and everything else. Okay, if there's a bright line, it has something to do with this idea of self-transcendence. So, gods and humans. God makes us in God's own image, and that means just self-transcendence, that kind of freedom, a truncated freedom, a cut-off freedom, a not full freedom, a not limitless freedom, but freedom. And, that means God made us, as it also says in Scripture, that love. God is love. Notice that it doesn't say God loves, like something that God happens to do some days but not others, but it's of God's essence, of what it means to be God, to be love. That's Christians are not the only ones with that idea. For instance, in Islam, Allah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, the most compassionate, the most merciful. That is what God is. And if we're made in the image of God, then we have to be characterized by love. Freedom is necessary for love. You can't force freedom. I like to tell students when I maybe overshare that one of my favorite things in all the world is to wake up in the morning and look over and see that my wife is there. It's beautiful. It's a wonderful, best moment of the day. It really, really is. I'm not being facetious, but if she were there every morning because she was chained up there, it's totally, get the image out of your mind. I mean, it's a totally different. You know what I mean? What's great about it is because she does not need to be there. She is free not to be there. Freedom is necessary for love to really be love. If we're programmed in, if I created some robot that just behaved and spoke as if it loved you, but you knew it was programmed to do that, you wouldn't feel loved, no matter what the robot said or did. Love can't be programmed if it's going to be love. But what that means is it's a risk. Love can't be, forced. You can't require it by law. Although what's interesting is the Bible seems to require love. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Love your enemies seems to be a commandment. Love your enemies. I have trouble liking my enemies, don't you? I have trouble liking some of my neighbors every once in a while, don't you? But it's a commandment. So that's interesting. But we know that we can fail to obey that commandment, don't we? Alas, we know that. It means love requires the possibility not to love. The possibility. It raises the question of law and sin. People have asked over the eons, how come God didn't just create us to be good? Why not? God was limited by nothing other than God's self. God made a choice, evidently, to make us so that we could be sinners. And again, this is the big question. Why is that? What is original sin all about? God made us that way. Why? Why did God have to do? Why couldn't He just made us all good? The answer is right here. If God made us such that we would love no matter what, that it was programmed in, it wouldn't be love. We would not be made in the image of God, and we could not have personal relationship with God or with anything else. Not really. It would just be robotic. So if God wanted creatures for love, God had to make, not because someone told God outside of love, but just in the nature of love, God had to make creatures who at least had the possibility to refuse God's love, to refuse the love of other human beings, and refuse to love. Right? Now, God also is the one who gave us those commandments, who gave us the rules, the laws, set our natures one way rather than another, gave us our boundaries. And if there were no law, there would be no sin. If you think about it, the beginnings of the book of Genesis, the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. I mean, can you imagine the story? God creates Adam, God creates Eve. He introduces them to each other. Adam, Eve, Eve, Adam, get to know each other. Here's a garden. It's got everything you could possibly need. And enjoy your life. See ya. That wouldn't even be a story. There wouldn't be anything. If that were a script for a movie, you wouldn't make it. Because nothing's going to happen. No, it gets all exciting when God creates Adam and Eve and introduces them to each other. Adam, Eve, Eve, Adam. Here's this garden. There's everything you could possibly need. There's nothing that you would have to ever go without. You can have a beautiful life together, but do not touch that tree. Do not eat that fruit. Now we got a story. Why did God say that? What happens if I eat that apple? What if I get in trouble? What happens? Can I be reconciled? What's going to happen? Now we've got drama. So love then requires the possibility of sin. St. Paul, thought about this. He says, well, again, is God responsible for sin? If God had just not made the law, there would not have been sin. Is it all God's fault? And Paul says, perish the thought. It's not what I'm saying at all. Original sin is not the first sin, the first concrete sin, an apple eating or two people's disobedience of God. Original sin is a structure. It's a structure, an ontological structure in the nature of the kind of thing that we are, that makes us the kind of thing we are, makes us the kind of thing that can love, and makes us the kind of thing that has a tendency to break boundaries because we're built that way. We're built that way, right? That's our situation. And so the possibility of sin is always there. It doesn't mean we have to sin or we're going to sin, right? It's not that would be a different kind of programming, and we weren't programmed like that. But if there's to be love, there's got to be freedom. And if there's freedom, there's got to be the possibility to reject love and to reject the law and to sin. And love also, I think we should say, does require the law. It does require boundaries. Certainly if you have children, you don't yet. I have kids and grandkids, and I can tell you for a fact that if I just told the kids or the grandkids, hey, do whatever you want, help yourself, no rules here, the child will feel unloved. You say, oh, I don't think so. Well, I'm here to tell you, there's got to be rules, there's got to be boundaries, disciplines, because it shows a kind of caring that there are natural limits, that we are not infinite. However self-transcendent we are, we're not infinite. we do have boundaries. We do have a nature. There are things that are no good for us, the things that are bad for us. Yes, we can do them, but they're bad for us. That's our law. That's our natural law, as we'll talk about in a future discussion. But love requires the law and our discipline. So what's going on here? How can we understand exactly what Augustine wants to talk to us about ourselves? And I think what Augustine is doing in many ways can be mapped on to what Plato is teaching and what we talked about when we discussed Plato's metaphysics and his ethics and his epistemology and the story of the Euthyphro, and what makes something the kind of thing that it is, and how do we come to know things. I think that model is at work in Augustine as well, and that's only natural, right? When something extraordinary happens, and you would have to say that Jesus was extraordinary, and you want to explain it to people, you have to, as a good teacher, you would want to take them from where they are to where you would like them to get to. And the educated people of Augustine's day knew Plato's philosophy. All the educated people did. The few that were educated knew Plato's philosophy. So I think Augustine is trying to think this story in Platonic terms. So let me tell you what I mean by that. So this is Plato. This is what we talked about before. The little blue screen bean there is us, human beings. And what is us? What am I? Well, I'm a human being. Well, what makes me that? I participate the form humanity. So do you. There's the form humanity, the idea and the ideal of what it means to be human. And each one of us is a copy or an image of that form. We are not the form in its totality. We're not the form in its fullness and perfection. We're not the form in its timelessness. We were not always here, and alas, we will not always be here as individuals, but the form humanity is eternal and unchanging, and for what it is, it's perfect in that sense. That's the original. We're the copy and the image. And when we are born, we are fallen into ignorance. As Plato says, in the trauma of birth, our immortal, invisible, immaterial souls, which had access to all the forms of all the things, and so knew everything and knew how everything would be best for it to be, in our being dropped down into these finite, limited, perspectival bodies, in all that trauma, everything got all blended together. So what happened? We were taught by our parents. But how did they teach us? They taught us by trying to get us to recollect those forms in all the images and copies of the individual things that we encounter in this world. This dog or that, this cat or that, this tree or that. Helping us each time to recall, to recollect what we already had within us, the forms before birth. And so the goal of human life, to restore ourselves to where we should be, is the education, the recollecting of the forms that we knew in our immortal, eternal souls that got scrambled up in this material, temporal life, perspectival life, and get us out from our fall into ignorance and raise us up into wisdom. If we could get there. Now it's going to be hard. Plato talked about it in the metaphor as if there was a cave, there's a deep, dark cave, and we see things only as shadows or images, and we have to scrabble our way up and out of the cave so we can see how things really are, the truth, the beauty, and the goodness of things for real, to become wise, and how hard that is, and how much resistance we meet. But if knowledge is our problem, education is our solution. And if no one does evil knowingly, as we talked about, then if we could become knowers and if we could become wise, we would not be evil. We would be how we were meant to be, how we're best for us to be. That's Plato's story. That's just a review. Now, Augustine tells a similar kind of story. He says, okay, what are we? Well, we are made in the image of God. But when we're born, we're fallen into original sin. What is that? That's that self-transcendence. That's that kind of sort of infinity, but not real infinity. That kind of sort of godliness, godlikeness, but not God. And what's the problem there? Well, we try to transcend every barrier. We try to go from sort of kind of infinite to truly infinite. We kind of live out what Augustine and later the atheist existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre will call the same thing, a desire to be God. But in Augustine's story, as it's told in the Confessions, he tries all kinds of things. He tries wealth, he tries fame, he tries love and marriage, everything that he could think of to feel complete, to feel fulfilled. And he even, recognized in Christians something he wanted. He said, look at these people. I mean, how satisfied are they? How at peace are they? It's amazing. I mean, you could take these people and throw them to the lions, and they'd still be singing hymns on the way. I mean, I wish I had that kind of peace. He wasn't always a Christian. His mom was, but not him so much. Not at first. And he said, boy, I would love to be like that. But he didn't. He had this wonderful prayer that sort of captured this ambivalence. Yes, the Christians, they're the ones. They have that peace and satisfaction that I want. But he prayed, Lord, make me chaste and continent, pure and self-controlled. Lord, make me chaste and continent, but not yet. Amen. Right? But not yet. Why? Because he realized if he were to go the whole way, he would lose himself, the self that's always looking for more, the self of inordinate desire, the self of sin. But it was him, and he didn't want to give that up. And in fact, he tells a story. It got so bad, this tension between wanting the satisfaction and the peace of mind and of being how he was meant to be, and trying to retain being himself, that tension that he couldn't fix. Right? He just did not want to do what he knew he ought to do. He knew what he ought to do. He just didn't want to do that. And that tension got so strong, that his will became so ill from this tension that he had what you and I would call a nervous breakdown. And he tells a story about being in a churchyard and he's just weeping and he's a mess. And he can't take it anymore. And he hears over the wall kids playing. And kids when they're playing, they kind of sing songy, na 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 na, kind of sing. And he hears this, and he thinks anyway. He hears the children singing, "Take it and read it, take 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 it and read it." What's that? And he thought about this story he heard of this other guy, who was not a Christian, kind of a tough guy, and one day he was on some kind of mission that goes into the church to grab up somebody, and he just walked in, and the priest was giving the homily or reading from scripture or something, and this friend of Augustine's told him, he says, you know what, it was like, I wasn't expecting, but it's like I was being spoken to directly. And this friend of his converted. So Augustine remembers this story, and he calls over a friend. He says, go get me some scriptures. And I guess he did one of those things that maybe you do sometimes, where you just take the Bible and you kind of flip pages and stick your finger in some, see what it says, see if you get a message. Well, I guess Augustine did something like that. He flips the page, sticks his finger down, and he reads a passage, and the passage he reads, like a lightning flash, saves him. Just like that. Now the story is, the will is broken. He didn't want to be good. The will was for more and more and have no limits. But God created us not to be gods, but to be friends of God. And there were limits, and he didn't want that. His will was broken. And we talked about this. If your will is broken, what's the solution? If it's knowledge that's the problem, the solution is education. But if the will is broken, what's the solution? What do you do with somebody who doesn't want to be good? Well, in this story, God has to do the action. God, through God's grace, not because Augustine did the right thing, but because God is God, and God is love, and God loved Augustine and reached down and saved him. God must act. You can't make God act. It's not something that's open to the human will, according to this story. So Augustine is saved because of this, incredible moment of God's action, not his own, but God's action. That's the solution. So, just to review, last slide here. These are the two views of our human situation next to each other. For Plato, the problem is we're fallen to ignorance, and ignorance has a solution. It's a hard road, it's a difficult road, and not everybody gets there, but in principle, you could get there. You could become how it's best for you to be. You could become wise. You could become, at least, if not wise, at least a philosopher, which may be the best that any human can do to recover our full humanity. In Augustine's story, we're fallen into sin. The problem is not with the knower, but with the willer. And we're fallen into sin, and all human efforts to fix that structural problem, call it original sin, to fix that problem will fail. Only if God acts in God's grace can the person be saved. Now, if your very next question is, which one of those two stories is the right story? Is it Plato's story or is it Augustine's story? Well, that I'm going to leave to you.